All right, so common question we get from folks when they use the platform. They put their spec in, they press start building. It might be a 6-month massive project, right? And our system has to run for 8 to 12 hours depending on the size of the spec. And they sometimes say, like, why does it take so long? Because they're used to System 1 AI giving them a couple lines of code, and we're giving them 50 or 100,000 lines of code. So what's happening in that 8 to 12 hours?
You mean why does it take 12 hours to compress 6 months?
Exactly. That's the common question. Yeah. What's happening?
That's a great question. But you've given us, if it's taking 8 to 12 hours, you've given us a tech spec that is probably 10 to 20 pages long.
Yep.
And in that tech spec, you have defined a bunch of components, third-party services. You could have a database provider, you could have an authentication provider, you could have your infrastructure based on a hyperscaler. You could have a bunch of other integrations and services that define your product. You could have your front end. Like all of this takes time to nail out perfectly. Like if you went to a System 1 based solution, like a chatbot that gives you an immediate answer, it would not take into account all of the complexities involved. Because for example, as soon as you select a database provider and define a schema, your entire application depends on that schema. So unless quite often you nail down what your database is based on, you cannot decide what your front end is going to look like. Because if you want to display stuff in a form, it depends on if the entries in that form actually exist in your database. If you want transactions to be logged and proxied somewhere else, it depends what logging solution you're using and if the system supports that. And this is just databases. This applies to authentication. This applies to what infrastructure you're using. This applies to the design of your application. Is it microservices based? Is it a monolith? And there are N factors like this that go into designing these solutions. And that's why it takes a team of human engineers 6 months to do it. We've compressed this down to 8 to 12 hours using AI, but we are making sure that we are doing the same things that the humans are doing. And we are designing what needs to be done sequentially. We're doing it sequentially, and what can be done in parallel, we're doing in parallel. Right?
I think the question is really driven out of curiosity, right? It's like, I've never had a system that I give a huge task to, and then some amount of time happens, and like, what's happening when I'm asleep, right? And so you explained some of the planning, but it would be interesting for you to sort of break it down by time chunk, right? Like how much is sort of used for planning, how much is used for generation, how much is used for validation.
Sure. So for a 8 to 12 hour job,
let's take a 12 hour. Let's do a big one. We'll do a big one.
Let's say a big job like 12 hour. For a 12 hour job, 9 to 10 hours is thinking. And when it's thinking, is doing all of the tasks that I described earlier, selecting the right tools that you told us, designing the architecture and the schemas for all of them, proxying those choices to all of the agents that are designing different components, and then ensuring that everything is grounded in the spec.
And so in the planning step, how many agents are involved? What does that look like?
In the planning step is that's the biggest step of everything. So if the job as a whole has about 3,000 agents, about 2,000 to 2,500 of those agents are assigned to the thinking step. And that's just because of how complicated the process is. It depends on the design. It's not a static number. It's not that 3,000 agents work on every single job. If your job is complex enough, there could be more than 3,000. For the average job, it could be 100 agents, and it could take a few hours, maybe 2 or 3
Something
hours.
small,
right? If the project is small. So it's a dynamic recruiting system, agent recruiting system, that is agents are allocated based on complexity, and that's how the planning state works. This is like a majority, like 70 to 80% is planning. The next part is code generation, which is much faster thanks to all of the optimizations that we've been doing and the model providers have done on the cloud infrastructure. It doesn't take as long. It takes about an hour or two, depending again on how complex things are. But then there's validation that happens after that could take another hour or two, again depending on quantity, but typically it's about an hour or less. And that's where we compile all your code and fix any errors. So we save you hours of reprompting that you would otherwise do with Cursor or solutions like that, and give you code that is ready to run out of the box.
That sounds like a pretty good deal to me.